Riley, are you ready?
I am, but are you ready? This week the tables are turned. Welcome back to Brant History Happy Hour. Today I am drinking a lovely beverage that is 1 part ginger ale, 1 part club soda, and then 1.5 ounces of whiskey and a little bit of lemon. So Nathan, what are you drinking?
Well, I'm drinking, it's 2 shots of gin, a shot of sweet vermouth, and a little bit of orange juice. So the reason that we're drinking these 2 drinks today is Natalie's is called the Presbyterian, and mine is called the Church Lady Martini. And the reason we have these 2 drinks today is because we're going to talk about the life and times of Dr. William Cochrane, one of Brantford's most nationally renowned preachers, and he was fundamental in the building of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. Cheers.
Cheers! Okay, so set the stage for us in Brantford. How does his life start?
Whoa, wait a minute. We aren't in Kansas anymore, Dorothy. We gotta go back to Paisley, Scotland in 1831. So it's February 9th and William Cochrane is born. We don't know who his father is. In the memoir, it just mentions his father and it doesn't give him a name. But his mother is from Erin, Scotland. His mother is also the daughter of a Reverend John Macmillan and a niece to Reverend Angus Macmillan. So it's quite clear from the beginning parts of his life, the church played a fundamental role in his life.
A lifelong friend of Cochrane, named J. Clark Murray, supplements information from another friend, John Stewart, about his childhood, saying, "I remember indeed his mother. Away back in the 40s, when I was a child, I used to see her occasionally. She was then a widow, living with her son in a house on Love Street. You know, across from the Hope Temple Gardens, where that fountain is now."
Wow, so Alexander Graham Bell's not the only Brantfordian that grew up in Scotland? Crazy! So what's it like when he grew up in Scotland?
Yeah, so when he grew up, he started as a young child, very, very kind of smart. He was speaking and able to start school when he was 4 years old. And then he was bright and breezy little fellow. His handwriting was beautiful, his spelling meticulous. So by 1843, he's 12 years old and he starts working in a local shop called Murray and Stewart. And they're a bookstore and he's a messenger boy just running messages for them. And by the time he's a few years later, he's actually running the entire bookstore.
Members of the public would find it easy to spend half an hour looking through the books in his shop. I soon found that he knew books not merely by the outside or by their commercial value. His talk seems to be attracted to works of a religious or theological nature. It soon became clearly evident that his heart lay in the work of the church.
So how does our boy become involved in the church?
All right, so Cochrane's getting involved with the Free Middle Church in Paisley. And the minister there, also named William Fraser, and he is producing sermons, and because of Cochrane's association with the bookstore, he starts laying out and typesetting and publishing his sermons. So they're kind of working together a lot. So by the time he's 18, they're kind of best minister buddies, and they're helping each other out with the work that needs to happen at the Free Church. So on top of this, he's doing other things. He's also involved with the Young Men's Christian Association, little YMCA there. And then there's another association called the Young Men's Sabbath Morning Association. So it's essentially like a Sunday school.
It had several branches throughout the city where they would read a short essay on a Bible passage or topic, and members were expected to chime in with their reflection. People would say, "Cochrane is connecting with the amazing fertility of expression at a time when most of us are just stammering into the faculty of intelligible public speech. Others would remark, that wee body, Cochrane, has a wonderful gift of the gab.
So Cochrane's also wanting to continue his education while he's running this bookstore. So he enrolls in the University of Glasgow, and he attends classes there in the morning so he's able to get back and open the bookstore. So in order to get there, he's got to walk. The train's kind of unreliable, so it's 8 miles from his house to the university, and he walks it. So often he leaves in the morning before the sun's up, so it's all dark or pouring rain. And he had this scarlet cloak that he used to wear, and his fellow colleagues at the college, they always describe theirs as like this tattered red kind of color, but Cochrane's for some reason is like this bright scarlet red, and he's got a button on it, and he does it up close right around his neck, so it's like he's keeping himself warm from the elements and the bad weather in Scotland.
This makes me just want to go to the Scottish village right now. Well, okay, so how does he come to North America then?
Alright, so it's July 11th, 1854, and all of a sudden his mother dies, and he calls it the most agonizing day in his life.
2 or 3 days after the funeral, Mr. Robert Brown of Cincinnati, an old friend of the family, came to Paisley to visit Mrs. Cochrane. He was shocked when he heard she was in her grave. In his own name, as well as his brother Daniel, he offered William ample pecuniary assistance to study for the ministry if Cochrane would come to America. So, a year to the date after the death of his mother, he is on the steamship Glasgow, coming to America. So he travels to America, a voyage that lasted 17 days. He notes that while at sea, there is a birth, a baptism, 2 deaths, and a burial. There was also a fight, a fire, and a narrow escape from fog on the banks of Newfoundland before he arrives in New York. He stays in New York for a couple of days and goes to church on Sunday, Obvi, before leaving for Cincinnati on the Thursday.
How does Cochrane make out in Cincinnati?
Okay, so it takes him about a day to reach Cincinnati. And when he gets there, he's greeted by Robert Brown and his brother Daniel, and both of them together, they're both prosperous merchants in Cincinnati. So they got the money and they can do whatever they want. So they kind of have like a little mini Scottish reunion, kind of like a Scottish village. And he gets acquainted with some of the Scots who have moved over to America. And so Cochrane's there now, and he's able to get ready for his first Sabbath in Cincinnati.
He hears Dr. Briggs preach his sermon on, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." But he notices Americans have a different approach on the Sabbath. He says, "On my way to and from church, I witnessed a great many shops open. Tobacconists, confectioners, grocers, even the drapers." One of the teachers in the Sunday school is dismissive of Cochrane's complaint, and at the dismissal responds, "Such is a Cincinnati Sabbath."
So, now that he's in Cincinnati, how does he become a minister?
So Cochrane's got to go to college, and he hears about this college in Hanover. So him and Brown go there. They have to travel down the Ohio River overnight on a boat, and then they have to get on a carriage and be driven to this college another hour's drive away. So he finally gets there and thinks he's made a vital error because it would essentially have taken him just as long to complete his ministerial degree in Scotland. So he's got to go and do his bachelor's at Hanover, and then after that he's got to do another 3 years of theology seminary.
To get admitted, Cochrane must complete an entrance exam. Included in this examination is algebra, which Cochrane knew next to nothing about and only had 6 weeks to prepare. After readying the exam, the faculty said, Okay, we'll allow you in on the condition that you skip Greek in your first term and give your attention to mathematics.
So, how does our smart cookie do with his classes after that?
Well, he does very well because in 4 of his classes he gets 100% and his lowest mark is a 98. So he does pretty darn well. He's also really critical of himself during this time. He had that bad experience with math, so he's in mathematics one day and he gets confused and he describes himself as utterly failing. And so he's determined not to let it happen again. So it seems like he does that because by August 1857, he's finished his first degree at Hanover.
During his time at school, he was pronounced an anti-slavery man, which he called a hellish invention. One of his fellow students tried to prove it through quoting scripture to Cochrane. His only rebuttal was, "If you can prove it by scripture, I'll turn infidel in a week."
So, he's done at Hanover and finally on his way to Brantford?
Not exactly, not yet. So, classic summer student move. He needs to do some stuff during the summer. So, while he's hanging out in Cincinnati over the summer, he knows this Dr. T.J. Smith at the 4th Presbyterian Church in Cincinnati. So he goes and he starts preaching there during the summer. And he talks there about the choir question. So he says, if the minister is great, then the singer isn't. If the singer's great, then the minister sucks. And if you have both of them that work together, then the session or the church, where you're going is just all wrong. So it's quite clear that there was tons of problems with the church even back then, and some of them probably still exist today. So he's finishing in the summer, and then he's on his way to do theology school, and he goes to swanky Ivy League and goes to Princeton.
He didn't find Princeton that difficult. His teachers were Doctors Hodge, Green, Alexander, and McGill. In December of his first session, he preaches his first sermon, and McGill notes it as very animated and a style of oratory that might be expected from one born in Ireland with a Western education. The summer of 1858, he spent a considerable time preaching to the congregation in Montgomery, outside of Cincinnati.
So is he finally done school?
Almost. He returns to his last year of studies, and then he faithfully completes it. So just before that, in November of 1858, he's supplying in a pulpit and preaching a sermon in New York City. And there's some people there from a neighboring community called Jersey City. And so they hear Cochrane preach, and they're like, man, we gotta have this guy. So they say, okay, come preach at our church. And he's like, okay, I'll do it, but I don't want to be considered a candidate for the position because I haven't graduated yet. So he goes there April 18th and he preaches his sermon, and they're like, congratulations, you're hired. And then he goes back and officially graduates April 26th, a couple days later, and then accepts the position at Jersey City.
So on July 2nd, 1860, the Africa arrives in Liverpool, and Cochrane transfers to the Princess Royal, which arrives in Greenock. By 4 p.m. the next day, he arrives back in Paisley. Cochrane receives a warm welcome from his old Paisley friends, and he preached every Sabbath. Then the big day arrives, July 24th. He had promised before he left America that he would be back after he successfully obtained his degree and a position, and take Miss Mary Houston's hand in marriage. They spent their honeymoon in Edinburgh, and at the end of the summer, headed back across the Atlantic to his congregation in Jersey City, where the congregation presents $100 to Mrs. Cochrane.
So we're still not in Brantford?
No, but almost. This is where the connection comes in, okay? So when he's doing his oral examination at Princeton, there's this guy there named Dr. Thompson. And Dr. Thompson is a preacher, and he lives in Galt. So him and Cochrane are like bestie or kind of like buddies. And so Cochrane occasionally goes and visits Thompson up in Galt.
So, in December of 1861, Cochrane is visiting Dr. Thompson, and Thompson says, "Yo, Cochrane, there's this Zion Church in Brantford that is having some Christmas do at the Kirby Hall. Do you want to go preach?" Cochrane's like, "Yeah, I love a good sermon to preach at people." Or is it to people? Anyways, yeah, I'll do it. The congregation hears Cochrane, and on May 14th, 1862, he is ordinated. Is that the right word? Ordained minister of Zion Presbyterian Church.
So we're finally in Brantford! How does he get along with the congregation?
Well, the congregation's not really in strong position when he gets there. So they've just built this new swanky church. It costs $17,000. They're $9,000 in debt. So Cochrane's got to do something to make the Lord's work happen, so to speak. So when he arrives, there is 150 people in the congregation. That's it. By the following year, it's now 260. They have an income of $2,500, of which $600 has to go to debt retirement. So he because the church is starting to grow, he starts expanding its work that he does, and he forms these little missions. One's in like Eastward, one's down in Eagle Place, and another one down in West Brant. That becomes Balfour United Church.
By 1867, they expand the sanctuary, adding galleries for the expanding congregation. In 1871, the remaining $5,000 of debt is paid off, allowing Cochrane's stipend to be raised to $1,600. In 1876, a new organ was added, and by 1883, a $15,000 expansion is completed, adding rooms in the basement for Bible classes, frescoing, and carpeting and cushioning of the auditorium, accommodating up to 1,000 congregants. On January 7th, 1871, the bells are ringing for church as normal. Mrs. Cochrane has been in failing health for some time. Cochrane had prepared 2 sermons, but never got to preach either of them. At 10 minutes to 11, the final call came for Mrs. Cochrane to the church above.
So is Cochrane like going out on the town trying to find a new wife?
Well, not right away. It talks in his memoirs about what happens with people who lose their loved one early on in their life, and it describes 2 scenarios. One where they go into like seclusion and mourning, which is very like Victorian-esque, and the other option is that they find more work for themselves and they like lose themselves in the work. So Cochrane takes the latter. He does take some time, but then by 1871 he's starting to get busy, and in 1872 he accepts the convenership of the Home Missions Committee. So think about this as like missionaries on the Western Front in Canada. So in 1874, he's a founder of the Brantford Young Ladies College that educated some people like Sarah Jeanette Duncan. So in 1875, he's appointed the clerk of the Synod of Hamilton and London, and he's already been the secretary for the Paris Presbytery for a number of years. So he also becomes the president of the Mechanics Institute, and he's selecting books for the Free Library in Brantford. So you can see that Cochrane's a pretty busy guy.
Cochrane also writes a weekly journal summarizing his activities for the week, and is like, Sabbath, preached on Joshua, which is a total lie, by the way, and Luke, as well as attending Sabbath schools. Monday, all day at council meetings. Tuesday, Presbyterian Stratford and Mayor's dinner. Wednesday, Aurelia. Thursday, Beaverton. Friday, Port Hope. Saturday, Sabbath, and Monday, Deseronto. Tuesday, back in Brantford. Cochrane really likes to go on tour.
Wow, Cochrane's flying all over the place. He's like a Presbyterian Superman. How does he get all this stuff done?
I know, right? So, on one of his tours, he goes to Oakville, and there he meets a Mr. Robert Balmer, and he's the postmaster in town. He's also an elder of the Presbyterian Church there. So, Robert introduces him to his daughter Jeannie, and they hit it off. She's wanted to be involved in the church for a long time since she's been growing up. So they kind of hit it off, and they got married October 2nd, 1873. So people would often come from all over the place to visit them, and they would stay at their house in Brantford that they called the Cochrane Hotel, known for its hospitality. But on top of that stuff, he still got to go out to that mission field and do that home missions work.
In 1873, his second year on home missions, Cochrane goes on tour to Manitoba with a Dr. Urey to figure out what is going on in the West. A Professor Bryce says, "We need to open a college in connection with the Manitoba College at Winnipeg." Mr. John Black says, "No, the school should be in our neck of the woods in Kildonan." So Cochrane and Urey are tasked with figuring it out, and the college becomes established in Winnipeg.
So, Manitoba's pretty cold. Does he only go there once?
No, he must have liked it out there, because he goes out again in 1881, and he's going there when there's 29 ministers at that time compared to 8 when he was there earlier. So on this tour, he's actually going to lay the foundation, the cornerstone for Manitoba College. So he's out there and he meets Lord Lorne, and they're there for the ceremony at Manitoba College. Also on this visit, he meets up with Reverend James Robertson and Professor Bryce. So it's interesting to note that Bryce, Robertson, and Cochrane, they were all involved in the Paris Presbytery very, very early on. So it's really Paris that did the brunt of the work in setting up the church's work in the Northwest.
He also goes on a tour in 1887, and after the General Assembly in Winnipeg, he also visits Birtle, Elkhorn, Banff, Regina, and Portage-la Prairie. It is interesting to note that the Presbyterian Church was also part of the residential school system, and some of these locations, like Birtle and Portage-la Prairie, had schools associated with them. Was Cochrane playing a role in the residential school system? We don't have any definite answers on this, but it's something we'll have to look into later.
Alright, enough about Manitoba. Where else does he go?
So everyone likes a summer holiday tour, right? So that's what Cochrane does in 1878. He goes up to Muskoka, at that time known as the Presbytery of Barrie. The Presbytery is so big at that time, it's essentially everything north of Barrie throughout the rest of Ontario. So first of all, he starts off his tour in Parry Sound, and it's one of those super hot and humid summer nights, and he's got so many people there waiting to hear his sermon, and he describes it as having 2 congregations, one inside and one outside. And for some reason, he thinks the outside one had the better reception of his sermon. So when he finishes preaching in Parry Sound, he goes from there to Rousseau, and then to Bracebridge, and then he goes to Barrie, opens a church in Barrie, and then he starts his tour farther north. So then he's going to other places in far northern Ontario, like Bruce Mines and the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. Just kidding, he just went to Sault Ste. Marie. But anyways, he goes on subsequent tours, Muskoka tours, in 1881 and 1885.
Manitoba, Muskoka, sometimes he's in the States and in Europe. Where else does Cochrane go?
So he also goes on a tour of British Columbia after his election as the moderator in 1882, when there is only one Presbyterian church in BC at the time. He goes to Victoria, New Westminster, Yale, Nanaimo, and Langley. He also goes after his trip to Manitoba in 1887, going to Vancouver, Victoria and Nanaimo again, and Wellington Mines. A third and final visit in November 1890 sees him bring home 3 British Columbia girls to enroll at the Young Ladies' College in Brantford.
Okay, so let me get this straight. He's minister at Zion in Brantford. He is the director of the Home Missions, and he's moderator of the church in Canada. So what else does this guy possibly have time for?
So remember when he was back over in Scotland working with Minister Fraser and publishing his sermons? So essentially he does the same thing. He goes kind of back into the publishing business. So he always wanted to preach from his sermons that were fully written out. He didn't like Cole's Notes kind of version. He wanted everything there and he would read from it. And often he actually wouldn't even need his notes. But anyways, so also when he goes on tours and some of his vacations, he also sends back letters to the press in Canada so they're able to publish them in the Globe and Mail. And the reason that they're getting published in the Globe and Mail is because at this time, George Brown is back in Brantford at Bow Park Farm. And when he's at Bow Park, his congregation is Zion Presbyterian Church. So he just essentially calls up a favor from one of his congregants and it gets published in the Globe.
Cochrane then starts publishing his sermons, including The Heavenly Vision, Christ and Christian Life, and The Church and the Commonwealth. These are all sermons that were preached first here in Brantford at Zion. He also publishes memoirs of Reverend Inglis, one of his preacher buddies from Ayr, and Man of Canada, a volume of biographical sketches of prominent Canadians in 1891.
So what's Cochrane like as a common citizen?
Well, he took his civic responsibilities very seriously. He always voted in every election and did not like some of the requirements in the States. They essentially had this thing called statute labor, which involved like everyday citizens assisting and helping with like digging of ditches and building of roads. So he had to do this while he was in Hanover. He also describes voting in the States, and he votes for the Republican ticket, but then when he comes to Canada, he's always referred to as a liberal.
Dr. Cochrane gave no explanation and made no apology for discharging any political duties, and denies calls that he is a blind partisan. A friend asked him what effect the resolutions passed by the church had in regard to the Jesuits' Estate Act would have on his vote. Cochrane's response was, "Tut! I'll vote for Patterson just the same."
Wow, Cochrane's like one of the busiest Brantfordians ever. It's pretty amazing. But Nathan, how does this whole thing end?
Okay, so now we go to Monday, October 10th, 1898. Cochrane is still doing his home missions work. He attends a meeting in Toronto. And then by Wednesday, he's on his way back to Brantford. And when he comes back to Brantford, he finds out that Mrs. Cochrane's sister, who's married to Sheriff Watt, has just died just before noon. So he's a little shocked by everything. And he tries to like delve in and help out. So he wants to help out with the funeral arrangements. He does that. Thursday is visitation, so he's busy involved with the visitation. Friday, he's helping out with the funeral and preaching at the funeral. And then Friday evening, he spends the evening at home and he complains of being very tired and worn out.
Saturday, he prepared his sermons for the morning and evening. The morning sermon was entitled, If Need Be, based on 1 Peter 1:6, and the Pilgrim's Song, based on Psalm 64:54. He then writes in his weekly diary, including what was going to happen the next day. He then becomes suddenly ill, and Dr. Philip arrives and says, "This is angina pectoris," and stays with him, and he seems to be getting better the next day.
So Monday afternoon, he's starting to feel better. He gets his daughter Mary to help him respond to some correspondence that's piling up. And then he starts preparing for a wedding that he's supposed to do the next day. And in the evening, he gets seized with intense pain, and Dr. Philip rushes back to try and help him, but it's useless essentially, and by 10:15 p.m. he's dead.
The next day, the national press all confirmed the death of Cochrane. Tuesday and Wednesday, his body lay in state in his house on Charlotte Street. That's the building the museum is in, by the way. Anyways, on Thursday afternoon, the funeral occurs at Zion, with ministers coming from all over to speak about Cochrane. The procession out of the church takes 30 minutes to go past the people inside and outside the church, and then up George Street to Greenwood Cemetery, where he was buried.
Wow, Reverend William Cochrane all over the place. Not only did he make this massive impact in Brantford, but literally North America. It's amazing.
Yeah, so this is the story of our little boy from Paisley, Scotland, who grew up without a father, ran a bookstore, then moved to America to become a preacher, and then moved to Brantford, grew the congregation here, then became the convener of home missions, and eventually the moderator of the Presbyterian Church of Canada. So, join us next week when we're going to do a special political episode of Brant History Happy Hour. Cheers!